taken a lot of pre-existing trends, bad ones, and made them worse. But we ought to understand that Republican presidents, including the last one, use signing statements. They'd sign a bill and say, I hereby sign this bill, except I don't intend to enforce X, Y, and Z. So this has been a problem, actually, that is older than the Republic. Our country was founded in reaction against executive overreach, the prerogatives of the British sovereign. The Declaration of Independence is a litany of complaints about executive overreach. Conservatism, in its modern form, was born in reaction against two overreaching presidents, Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson. There was a kind of conservative preference for congressional supremacy. Indeed, one of the great texts of modern conservatism was James Burnham's book, Congress and the American Tradition, which was written while he was one of the founding editors of National Review. The problem is that the healthy suspicion of presidential power tended to weaken among conservatives because they had the heady and delightful experience of their own president in Ronald Reagan. And I think one of the things conservatives need to do is reacquire suspicion of executive power, reacquire a preference for the Congress. Begin by visiting the National Archives, where when you look at the parchment copy of the Constitution in the rotunda there, you'll see that half of the Constitution is Article 1, because Congress is the first branch of government in so many ways. Second, conservatives have to understand that as long as government grows, Congress's sway over the government will recede. As more and more power will leak into the bureaucracy, Congress will be always too busy to say quite what it means. It will pass laws that are not so much laws as sentiments. They'll say we ought to have adequate public education, and they'll turn it over to the Education Department to write 20,000 pages of regulations to tell Congress the implications of what it has said. It's a leakage away of congressional power. And finally, conservatives have to turn to the courts and find some friends in the court. They have to find a way to get the courts to acknowledge that Tom Colburn should have standing to sue the president if the president is violating the intent of the Congress of which he is a member. Courts have been very reluctant to referee arguments between the branches of government, and I understand that. But it's time for the Congress to make its case, and for conservatives to amend their vocabulary a bit. Conservatives have been much too dogmatic in denouncing what they call judicial activism. What we really want is a properly engaged judiciary, and part of the proper engagement of the judiciary is to referee the violations of the separation of powers.
Senator, you've been up there, you've watched this, and one gets the impression sometimes, do members of Congress actually want the power that they're supposed to cover? In other words, there was a proposal recently that the authors of which suggested an amendment to the Constitution that would require the Congress to essentially put its fingerprints on major regulatory efforts by the executive branch, either approving or not approving. And the people involved and said they talked to a dozen congressmen, they all said, well, we don't want that. We don't want to do that because so much has been left to the regulatory authorities within the executive branch that a lot of congressmen who don't pay much attention, they can whine about it, but their fingerprints are not. What's your experience in the Senate of the seriousness of people thinking about or being willing to fight for the institutional prerogatives of the body that you served in?
Well, I think that underlying all of that is a poor work ethic in Congress. I agree with George. The biggest problem in Congress is we're not specific in what we legislate. And so you have the call, which I'm a big supporter of the Convention of the States, because one of the first things you do is you give the Congress, if we're not going to fulfill our responsibility to be specific about what our intentions are, then we ought to have a responsibility and the authority to cancel out when the regulations and the bureaucracy go way beyond what our intent was. And so first of all, there's a laziness, a lack of a work ethic, which that. The second is is the Enumerated Powers Act, which John Shattuck, former congressman from Arizona, originally penned, and I'm a sponsor in the Senate, which says you ought to reconnect with the Constitution when you're legislating. Where do you have the authority to do this as granted by the enumerated powers? So I think we've given up a lot of power, but I think it's not power that we had to give up. It's power that we're so lazy that we don't want to do the hard work. You know, we just had a veterans bill on the floor where I contrasted what the Senate Veterans Committee had done compared to the House. The House had 60 hearings last year on veterans, 34 of them oversight to figure out why we're not doing it. The Senate had 15. 4 were oversight. You couldn't really call them oversight. So where's the work that we're paid to do to protect the Constitution, one? Number two, to gain the knowledge with which to solve real problems. And I'd say that that's all a function of the lack of leadership in our congressional bodies and the lack of directed leadership with the Constitution in mind as here's how we should go about that. What are our goals? If we truly want a limited government, then it's up to us to force those votes to make us have a limited government and to reinforce congressional intent. The other point I'd make is we're now running not under the rule of law, we're running under the rule of rulers. And when the very thing that binds us together as a nation is confidence in the rule of law. And that's where leadership comes in again. And poor leadership undermines that. Good leadership reinforces that. So I think we've given up a lot of power, but it doesn't have to be that way. That's why I think the idea of any regulation that has an impact of $100 million or more in the economy ought to have to be approved by Congress. You know, is this what you intended? Did you really mean to labor onto the economy $100 million worth of additional regulation?